feel like map consciousness is an impersonal process. Consciousness tries to come in and crowd out thought in place for perception and meaning making. I feel like by taking Seroquel, I'm poisoning my brain, so consciousness can't come in and crowd out the body in a way. I feel like consciousness is super powerful, and it's saying that there's a reality where we don't need bodies. They're light bodies, but we're not quite ready for that yet. And Will Hall made a statement about placebo and expectation as psychoactive substances, because he was talking about drugs being psychoactive substances, and it doesn't mean that a person necessarily has a mental illness, because any psychoactive substance will have an effect on anybody. So, but he said placebo and expectation is a psychoactive substance. And I was thinking about that in terms of, if I expect something, it's a certain biochemical state that is going to create that change in the brain to be receptive to healing. But I was thinking about care as a psychoactive substance and listening as a psychoactive substance. Can we be psychoactive substances for each other? And Will Hall talks about the harm reduction approach to coming off psych drugs. And I was thinking, can we take a harm reduction approach to the mental illness story? So to just decouple from that story 100% cold turkey isn't necessarily helpful. Like, I would like to do that and just say, oh, I don't believe in the system, I'm not going to take any of these drugs. But at the same time, my conversation with myself has been reducing the harm of that story and not necessarily believing that I have this defective brain, but also seeing that that story is still a part of my life, and I do have to make use of elements that go along with that story, but I can still reframe it. I can say, by taking a Seroquel, I'm just poisoning my brain, so consciousness can't come in and do such powerful things through my brain when I'm not really ready to act towards that yet. So it's a way of gearing down in consciousness. Whereas I could think, oh, that means I'm really mentally ill and I need to go home, when I see it as my brain is just powerful in a way. It's powerful beyond this ego self that I try to think that I am on a daily basis for convenient and functionality's sake. So what my brain is trying to do is something that is probably not considered functional within society's framework, but it's doing something, and I don't know what that is. And obviously there's things that the brain can do that are outside whatever the framework of constructed, cultured society is. And I don't mean cultured as in that's a good thing, but I just mean the way things have progressed for many, many years of humanity. And those are all false frameworks, and the brain is a living thing, and it's trying to move into this living dimension. And being in a beautiful place, it actually is seeming like it is trying to go with that opportunity to go further into beauty and further into non-locality and all these things that I don't even know what it's trying to do. But all I know is me as my ego self can say, hey, I'm going to take a Seroquel because I don't know what you're trying to do, brain, but I know what I can do to slow you down from whatever it is you're trying to do, because we got lots of time. We can go about this slowly. So where does the story of mental illness help, and where does it harm, and how can I reduce that harm? I already know for sure that this process of reframing and renaming and playing around with meanings and things has been helpful, because I don't see myself as mentally ill. Really, part of the point is there's no self there to be mentally ill. It's just a bunch of thoughts and programs, and they have kind of a life of their own sometimes. And that's part of it, because we think there's this me controlling the programs, but as soon as the programs get out of control, we see there is no me there controlling the programs. And any level of supposed control is minimal, and when that minimal amount of control gets released, it is kind of a scary process, but one can still induce and impose some level of control by taking medications, which probably just poison the brain into not growing so fast beyond the limits of society. Because if the brain grows beyond the limits of society, the body is going to act differently. It's going to behave in different ways. So it's like learning a dance. And I wonder if we can fill the airwaves with the sounds of perception. Not talking about me, but perception. And invite people to use words and language in a different way. And I do feel with taking the Seroquel that it's sort of like putting poison in my brain, so a lot of it dies. And that's okay, because my brain grows like weeds. The neurons grow like weeds, so whatever I killed off is just going to grow back. So it's almost a way to control neuroplasticity, to control the hyper perception, to have tranquil eyes, to be tranquilized, and just sort of lay there for a while and let the brain die back. Because just like grass, it's going to grow again. And getting comfortable with the fact that the brain is going to grow back and it's going to be just fine is good. It's almost really just seeing this neuroplasticity and how powerful the brain is, and how one can let it die back and it just grows back. It almost feels like the brain gets to the end of how far it can perceive at this time, and then the body has this reaction and gets scared because the brain knows that it's time to die. And so I take Seroquel, and that slows down the brain and lets it die back. And it's just a different game. It's like a game of the brain growing as much as it can and then having to die back, as opposed to just having this brain that's very stagnant and static throughout one's entire life. It's almost like consciousness has a different rhythm, and it gets to the furthest reaches it can in the human brain at that time, and then it dies. And the body reacts like the body's dying, but it's not. It's just consciousness dying back. And I think the medication sort of helps that dying back into thought and dying back into the level of the me again process. And I wrote down that the speed of consciousness is faster than the speed of thought. Thought is a movement in the brain cells of stored up images, probably in the DNA and in the molecules of emotion and the sounds. It probably moves at the speed of sound, whereas consciousness moves at the speed of light, or maybe even faster. And because one is perceiving light and making sound out of it, the light and the sound that that light makes grows the brain, and it can get to the upper limits quite quickly. I actually feel that the brain needs we's, other people, to ground it in that growth process. It's just like how certain kinds of plants do better when there's lots of them around. And I took some notes on David Bohm's book, Wholeness in the Implicate Order. And he was saying that a fragmentary self worldview is fostered and transmitted by the way we use language. And I feel like that is the way the ego thought uses language, the me. Sound in our own voice turned against ourself, creating a self, creating the molecules of the me with our language. And I feel like there's a non-fragmentary self trying to foster and transmit new worldviews, which is, if an insight springs up, that's a whole worldview right there. And there's got to be some kind of biochemistry of insight. So now the biochemistry, the biomolecule of insight, encodes the perception. And I'm wondering if in that molecule of insight and in the insight and the feeling and the sense of it itself, it's encoded in the actual words of the insight. So when somebody says an insight, it might sound like a thought, but if it's an actual insight and someone says it, it has the energy of insight. And if somebody hears the insight, they're absorbing the energy of insight, even if they just think they're absorbing English or a thought or somebody's statement. And this is a new way of using language, and we might not even have to really change the structure of language we use. It's more the quality of the seer and the perceiver and what they say. And they could maybe almost say anything, and it doesn't really matter. And though it's likely that the insight would have to get past the wall of thoughts of other people, so they have to listen non-judgmentally. Because the judgment is going to chop up the insight into little bits and classify it and therefore not listen to the insight, and it's not whole. And so it's translated into the past and into knowledge. And so each new insight becomes a worldview, as opposed to I feel XYZ being the worldview. And those are very few worldviews, whereas insights are unlimited. So there's no I there, it's just insight. And whatever insight says is the worldview of the insight at the time. It's something that one saw. It's something that one had an insight into. And that's seeing relationship and extrapolating. And David Bohm said something about to clarify what is meant by the relationship between the content of thought and the process of thinking which produces this content. And that's a pretty fascinating distinction. And I wrote down, it's a different process that produces the content of insight. So his statement alone is really fascinating when you really think about it. But then I was extrapolating that to how perception and insight produces different content than thought. So it's a different process. We go from thought processors to perception processors, and that process of perception creates different sound. It doesn't create the in sound of thought that is bouncing around for forever, and that happens when one identifies with what one says. So if I was to identify with some of the things that I say, they'd be bouncing around my head like, I think this and I think that, blah, 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 and waiting to be used as preformed sentences. Whereas if I just say an insight and it's gone, then the next one is there, and that space and that freedom is what is needed for this unending process of insight as opposed to the process of thought. So we still produce sound, it seems very much the same, like you can't really tell the difference. And the thing is, though, when one first gets acquainted with that state of making new sound, making new meaning, speaking as the moment, it seems weird to people, especially people that know that person, and then it's said to be a mental illness, when really it's just a reversal of sound and perception, of like looking at internal images and sounds to looking at the outside and producing sounds of the moment. And at first it is, yes, indeed, confusing, but after a while one wouldn't be able to tell the difference of a person who speaks based on thought and speaks based on insight. So that's the difference. It produces different content, and in a way, this self-dialogue is content of insight. So when consciousness flows through the perceptual apparatus and is not impeded by thought, then different sound is created. And I wonder if there is no real need to change the structure of the English language. I'm going to read that chapter of David Bohm's book next when I can, but it seems that my tranquil eyes might not be able to read it for a number of days until I'm not taking Seroquel, which again is just preventing information overload. My brain can't take in any more information. Because the thing is, with the process of perception, it's infinite. So it seems like the brain can only go along picking up information for so long. And maybe that's why this happened quicker this time. It's only been 2 months. I thought I would have 6. But I've been out and about and perceiving beauty and doing a lot. And my brain could have reached its capacity faster. And David Bohm gave a quote by Protagoras, and he said, "Man is the measure of all things." And then I wonder, well, what am I measuring? I think perception measures beauty and speaks the truth of the moment, whereas thought is a measure of the me and accumulated thoughts. So man is a measure of movement and beauty, measuring movement, gestures. And I think we are the measure in a way. And that relates to, say, somebody going into stress and seeing a situation and running away from it because they're measuring that it's not safe. And I think people who get in touch with the sensitivity of measuring as perception, measuring the moment, speaking as the moment, meaning, they actually do accumulate information over a certain period of time and actually sort of get spent and then appear as though they're not well. And that's a measure of society. That's a measure of what we've created, that we can't move fluidly and sensitively in this world without being crushed by it. And Dr. David Bohm wrote, Measure is a form of insight demonstrated by the clarity of perception and harmony of action to which it leads. So insight is a measure of perception, how insightful one is. And he said measure is an insight created by man. So we tend to measure the world with our thoughts, and those have been programmed, whereas if we're deprogrammed, we measure with insight. And we need insight into our measures, like, say, success. We have all these measures in the world that we go by that are pre-programmed, and we're not able to use our own perceptual measuring device. And the words we speak, in a way, are a measure. They're our measure of reality. And David Bohm mentioned that we use techniques to get to the immeasurable, say meditation. And then I had an insight that said perception is a technique of the immeasurable. So when you're in touch with the immeasurable, you don't need a technique to get to the immeasurable, but perception is a technique of the immeasurable to put some kind of measure to its immeasurability. The immeasurable sees through us, and what we say is a measure of the immeasurable, of if we're in touch with that, or are we just in touch with our thought structures? And then David Bohm said something about trying to reach the immeasurable. And a lot of times when I see something new by what somebody writes, it's not even related to what they're actually talking about. It's more the language. It gives me a hint of something. So the hint I got from that was, so he said, try to reach the immeasurable. And then I had the insight that we are that by which the immeasurable reaches out to itself as other humans and life forms. It's the process of life transforming itself, which is infinite. So we can try to reach the immeasurable, or we can reach out as the immeasurable.